The Boston Massacre. A single lantern swings in the March wind. Snow drifts across King Street, glowing orange in the torchlight. Boots crunch on frozen cobblestones. A drumbeat echoes, slow, hollow, foreboding. A lone British sentry stands before the custom house, breath rising in the cold. A crowd gathers, boys with sticks, sailors with fists, apprentices with anger in their eyes. A snowball arcs through the air, then another, then a club. The sentry shouts for help. A bell rings, not for fire, but for trouble. Redcoats march into the square, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. The crowd surges, voices rise. A club strikes a soldier's arm. A musket fires, smoke blooms in the torchlight. Screams cut through the night, bodies fall to the snow. The Boston Massacre has begun. March 5th, 1770, the night the Revolution found its martyrs. Act 1, the city under occupation. Boston in 1770 was a city simmering with resentment. British troops had been stationed there since 1768 to enforce customs laws. Their presence was a constant reminder of Parliament's authority. To the people of Boston, the soldiers were not protectors, they were occupiers. Tensions rose with every patrol that marched down King Street. Soldiers competed with locals for work, undercutting wages. Tavern brawls between redcoats and sailors became common. The Sons of Liberty fanned the flames of resistance. Samuel Adams wrote fiery essays condemning the occupation. John Hancock funded protests and political gatherings. The city was divided between loyalists and patriots. Every argument in a tavern felt like a spark waiting to catch. The presence of British troops made ordinary disputes feel political. A shove became an insult to liberty. A punch became an attack on the colony. The soldiers felt the hostility everywhere they went. They were jeered at in the streets. Children mocked them with chants. Women turned their backs as they passed. The soldiers responded with discipline at first, but discipline erodes under constant provocation. The officers knew the situation was volatile. They warned their men to avoid confrontation, but the city was too small, the anger too large. Every day brought a new incident. A rope walk brawl in late February left several soldiers injured. The resentment deepened. The soldiers felt surrounded by enemies. The citizens felt surrounded by soldiers. Boston was a powder keg. All it needed was a spark. But that spark came on the night of March 5th, 1770. Act 2, the night of the massacre. The night was bitterly cold. Snow fell in thin, swirling sheets. At around 8:30 p.m., a British sentry named Private Hugh White stood guard outside the custom house. A young wig-maker's apprentice accused White of striking his master. A crowd gathered, first a handful, then dozens. Snowballs flew. Someone hurled a piece of ice. Someone else swung a stick. White called for help. The town bell rang, drawing more people into the street. Captain Thomas Preston marched 7 soldiers to the scene. They formed a defensive line before the custom house. The crowd pressed closer, shouting insults. "Fire if you dare, you bloody backs, lobster scoundrels." The soldiers loaded their muskets. Preston ordered them not to fire. The crowd surged again. A club struck Private Montgomery, knocking him to the ground. He rose, musket slipping in his hands. Then a shot rang out. No one knew who fired first. Smoke filled the air. The soldiers fired into the crowd. Bodies fell to the snow. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent, was struck twice. One ball tearing through his chest, another grazing his arm. He fell instantly, becoming the first to die on King Street. Samuel Gray, a rope maker, was shot at near point-blank range. He collapsed beside Attucks. James Caldwell, a young sailor, staggered backward after a musket ball tore into his back. He died moments later. Samuel Maverick, only 17, was struck in the abdomen. Friends carried him away, but he would not survive the night. Patrick Carr, an Irish leather worker, was hit in the hip and groin. He cried out for help, unaware that his wound would prove fatal in the days ahead. The square fell silent except for the moans of the wounded. Act 3, the aftermath. Word of the shooting spread through Boston like wildfire. Bells rang again, this time in alarm. Thousands poured into the streets. The Sons of Liberty seized the moment. Samuel Adams demanded the immediate removal of British troops. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson tried to calm the crowd. He stood on the balcony of the townhouse, lanterns flickering around him. "Let the law have its course," he declared. The crowd reluctantly dispersed, but the anger did not fade. The next morning, the bodies were laid out for all to see. Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, and young Maverick. Maverick's death coming at dawn deepened the city's grief. He had been caught in the crowd by accident. Patrick Carr, lingering in agony, gave a dying deposition to a local doctor, insisting the soldiers had been provoked, a statement that would shape the trial. Carr died on March 14th, becoming the 5th official victim. Another wounded man, Christopher Monk, survived the night but never recovered. He would die in 1772, remembered as a martyr in all but name. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic and inaccurate depiction of the event. His print showed soldiers firing in unison on an unarmed crowd, transforming chaos into a tableau of tyranny. It became one of the most powerful pieces of propaganda in American history. The funerals drew thousands, the procession stretching for blocks as bells tolled across the city. The victims were hailed as martyrs for liberty. The British feared the city would erupt into open rebellion. Hutchinson ordered the troops withdrawn to Castle William. It was a humiliating retreat. The soldiers involved were arrested. Captain Preston insisted he had never ordered his men to fire. The trial became a test of colonial justice. John Adams agreed to defend the soldiers. He believed everyone deserved a fair trial. His decision cost him friends, but he argued the case brilliantly. He insisted the soldiers acted in self-defense. The jury acquitted Preston and most of his men. 2 were convicted of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. Act 4, The Road to Revolution. The Boston Massacre did not start the revolution, but it changed the emotional landscape of the colonies. It proved that British troops could and would kill colonists. It proved that occupation was incompatible with liberty. It proved that fear and anger could turn deadly in an instant. Samuel Adams used the event to build a network of committees of correspondence. These committees spread news, coordinated protests, and unified resistance. The massacre became a rallying cry. "Remember March 5th" appeared on broadsides. The victims were honored annually with orations. Each speech rekindled the memory of blood on the snow. The British tried to downplay the event. They called it a riot. They called it the incident on King Street, and they blamed the crowd, but the narrative had already been told. The colonists saw the victims as martyrs, the soldiers as symbols of tyranny, the custom house as a monument to oppression. The tension never fully eased. 3 years later, the Tea Act reignited the anger. The Boston Tea Party followed. Parliament responded with the coercive acts. Boston became the center of resistance. British troops returned in greater numbers. The city braced for conflict. The memory of the massacre hung over every confrontation. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, many saw it as the continuation of March 5th. The revolution had found its martyrs long before it found its battlefield. The snow of King Street had been the first proving ground. The blood spilled there had marked the point of no return. The Boston Massacre was not the beginning of the revolution, but it was the moment America realized the revolution was coming. The Boston Massacre was a tragedy born of fear, anger, and occupation. 5 men died in the snow, but their deaths reshaped a continent. Their blood became ink for pamphlets, fuel for protests, and memory for a movement that refused to fade. In the end, the massacre was not a riot nor a misunderstanding. It was a warning that a people who feel threatened will rise, and a people who feel oppressed will resist. The revolution did not begin on King Street, but on that cold March night, it found its first martyrs. 6 colonists were shot by British troops on March 5th, 1770. Crispus Attucks was struck twice, 1 bullet in the chest, 1 ricochet wound, and he died instantly. Samuel Gray was shot at close range and died instantly. James Caldwell was shot in the back and died shortly after. Samuel Maverick, a 17-year-old apprentice, was shot in the abdomen and he died the next morning. Patrick Carr was shot in the hip and groin. He lingered for about 2 weeks before dying on March 14, 1770. Christopher Monk was shot in the chest. He survived the night but never recovered, dying in 1772 from complications. Monk is not counted among the official 5 victims, but contemporaries consider him a martyr. The Boston Massacre trials, law, liberty, and the shadow of King Street. A quill scratches across parchment. Ink pools. A name is written. Captain Thomas Preston. Now a courtroom, packed shoulder to shoulder. Sailors, merchants, apprentices, widows. The air is thick with whispers and resentment. A judge's gavel cracks like a musket shot. The room falls silent. John Adams rises from the defense table. He smooths his coat, glances at the jury, and begins. Facts are stubborn things, he says. Cut to the snow-covered stones of King Street. Bloodstains fade into memory. The bodies are gone, but the questions remain. Who fired first? Who gave the order? And can justice survive a city on the brink of rebellion? Act 1. The city demands justice. Dawn broke over Boston on March 6, 1770, with the city still trembling from the night before. 5 men were dead, a 6th mortally wounded, and the snow of King Street stained with blood. The Sons of Liberty demanded immediate arrests. Acting Governor Thomas Hutchinson, fearing a riot, ordered Captain Thomas Preston and 8 soldiers taken into custody. The crowd wanted vengeance, not process, but Hutchinson insisted the law must speak before the mob did. The prisoners were marched through the streets under heavy guard. Some citizens jeered, others stared in grim silence. The soldiers looked stunned. They had expected to be rescued, not arrested. Preston maintained he never gave the order to fire. The soldiers insisted they acted in self-defense. The Sons of Liberty insisted it was murder. Boston prepared for the most consequential trial in its history. The stakes were enormous. Justice, legitimacy, and the fragile peace of a city on edge. If the trials were seen as unfair, rebellion might ignite early. If they were seen as too lenient, the people might revolt. Act 2. John Adams steps forward. Few expected anyone to defend the soldiers. Representing them was seen as siding with tyranny. But John Adams believed deeply in the rule of law. He agreed to defend Preston and the soldiers, knowing it could destroy his reputation. His wife Abigail supported the decision, though she feared the consequences. Adams argued that justice must be blind to politics. Quote, "Counsel ought to be the very last thing that an accused person should want in a free country," he wrote. His involvement shocked the city. Some called him a traitor to the patriot cause. Others admired his courage. Adams prepared meticulously, interviewing witnesses and studying the chaotic events of March 5th. He knew the trial would hinge on perception. Was the crowd a peaceful assembly or a violent mob? Were the soldiers aggressors or terrified men surrounded by danger? Adams believed the truth lay somewhere in between, and he intended to prove it. Act 3. The trial of Captain Preston. Captain Preston was tried first in October 1770. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The prosecution argued that Preston ordered his men to fire. Several witnesses claimed they heard him shout the command. Others insisted he said no such thing. The confusion of the night made certainty impossible. Adams focused on that uncertainty. He argued that in the chaos, no one could reliably identify who spoke. He emphasized that Preston stood in front of his men and would not have risked being shot by his own soldiers. The jury listened intently. Adams' calm, methodical style contrasted with the prosecution's emotional appeals. He reminded the jury that the law required proof beyond reasonable doubt. "Facts are stubborn things," he said. "Whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Captain Thomas Preston, not guilty. The courtroom erupted, some in relief, others in outrage. Preston was whisked away to avoid retaliation. The city braced for the next trial. The soldiers' fate would be harder to defend. They had fired their muskets, men had died, and the people wanted accountability. Adams prepared for the most difficult case of his career. The soldiers' trial would determine not only their fate, but the credibility of colonial justice. If the verdict was seen as unjust, Boston might explode. If it was seen as fair, the rule of law might survive. The stakes could not have been higher. The trial began in late November. Act 4, the trial of the soldiers. The 8 soldiers stood accused of murder, but their names were read aloud: Montgomery, Kilroy, Warren, Carroll, Horrigan, Macaulay, White, and Weems. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with expectation. The prosecution argued that the soldiers fired into an unarmed crowd. They displayed the blood-stained clothing of the victims. They called witnesses who described the horror of the night. Adams countered with a different narrative. He argued the crowd was not peaceful. It was a mob. He described the snowballs, the ice, the clubs, the taunts. He emphasized that Private Montgomery had been struck before firing. He argued the soldiers feared for their lives. Self-defense, he insisted, was not murder. Witness after witness contradicted the last. Some claimed the soldiers fired deliberately. Others insisted the first shot was accidental. The jury struggled to piece together the truth. Adams reminded them that the law demanded clarity. "If you are wavering," he said, "you must acquit." After days of testimony, the jury retired. They returned with a nuanced verdict. 6 soldiers were acquitted entirely. 2, Montgomery and Kilroy, were found guilty of manslaughter. They avoided execution by pleading benefit of clergy. Each was branded on the thumb with a hot iron. The punishment was symbolic, a mark of guilt without the gallows. The courtroom exhaled. Boston had survived its most volatile trial. The rule of law had held, but the wounds of March 5th remained open. The victims were still dead, the soldiers were still hated, and the city was still divided. Act 5, the legacy of the trials. The trials did not heal Boston, but they prevented immediate chaos. Samuel Adams accepted the verdict publicly, though privately he seethed. He understood that martyrdom was more powerful than vengeance. The funerals of Attucks, Gray, Caldwell, and Maverick had already unified the Patriot cause. Patrick Carr's dying deposition complicated the narrative, but not enough to blunt the political impact. Christopher Monk's lingering death in 1772 kept the memory alive. The trials became part of the revolutionary story. Patriots pointed to the massacre as proof of British tyranny. Loyalists pointed to the acquittals as proof of colonial fairness. John Adams' reputation, far from ruined, grew stronger. His defense of the soldiers became a testament to his integrity. Years later, he would call it one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. The trials also revealed the fragility of peace. Boston remained a city on the edge. Every patriot, every argument, every tax threatened to reignite the violence. The Tea Act of 1773 reopened the wounds. The Boston Tea Party followed. Parliament responded with the coercive acts. Boston became the center of imperial retaliation. British troops returned in greater numbers. The city braced for conflict. The memory of the massacre hung over every confrontation. The trials had shown that justice could prevail, but justice could not erase bloodshed. When the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, many saw it as a continuation of March 5th. The revolution had not begun in a courtroom, but the courtroom had revealed the stakes. Liberty, law, and loyalty were now in open conflict. The Boston Massacre trials were the last moment the colonies tried to resolve their crises through law alone. After 1770, the next verdict would be delivered by musket fire. The Boston Massacre trials were more than a courtroom drama. They were a test of a people struggling to define justice under occupation, a test of whether law could restrain anger and whether truth could survive fear. John Adams defended the soldiers not because he agreed with them, but because he believed a nation must be built on principle, not passion. The revolution would soon be fought on battlefields, but in the winter of 1770, it was fought in a courtroom, and the verdict shaped the destiny of a continent.